economist. And most of my work focuses on measuring productivity, profitability in the agricultural sector, and not very much environmental issues. However, while measuring the economic of the adoption of different innovations in Saskatchewan, I couldn't ignore measuring the tremendous efforts that producers have been doing since the 1980s to reduce greenhouse gas emission in Saskatchewan, while at the same time maximizing their profitability. The continuous adoption of sustainable farming practices in Saskatchewan, particularly the adoption of no-tillage or zero-tillage innovation package, not only improved farmers' productivity and profitability, but also reduced greenhouse gas emission. This reduction helps Canada meeting its commitment at the 21st Conference of the Parties, COP21, in the Empires towards the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to cut greenhouse gas emission by 30% below the 2005 level of emission by 2030. An important component in the COP21 is to include land use change, and forest, LUCF sector, and the measurement of the national emission inventories. And this is very important for Saskatchewan, as the province occupies around 38% of the total Canada's cropland, or around 25 million hectares. Let's have an overview of Canada's commitment. On December 9, 2016, the First Ministers of Canada agreed on the Pan-Canadian Framework, the PCF, on clean growth and climate change. Saskatchewan and Manitoba did not sign this agreement at that time. Manitoba joined the PCF later. The PCF aims at growing the economy while reducing greenhouse gas emission. An important component in the PCF is to price carbon pollution across Canada by 2018. Provinces and territories were flexible to come with their own pricing system to meet their carbon reduction targets. The revenue generated by pricing carbon will stay in the territory and the provinces of origin. Provinces and the territories were given until September 2018 to submit their own pricing systems. Saskatchewan remains the only jurisdiction that did not join the PCF. However, Saskatchewan released the Prairie Resilience, a made in Saskatchewan climate change strategy, which aims at developing new policies to reduce greenhouse gas emission in natural system, infrastructure, and economic sustainability. In addition, in August 29, 2018, Saskatchewan released carbon pollution price based on output-based performance standard, applied on big facilities that emit more than 25,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. The implementation date, January 2019, and the exception is electricity generation, natural gas transmission pipelines. That will cover 11% of total Saskatchewan emission. Therefore, the federal pricing system will apply partially in Saskatchewan and will include two pricing systems. The federal output-based price system, OBPS, applied to electricity generation and natural gas transmission pipeline. Implementation day was January 2019, and covers facilities that emit more than 50,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. The other pricing system, which was applied yesterday, and is equal to $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent, and it's the fuel charge, will increase by $10 per ton annually to reach $50 per ton by 2022. For more information on the detailed cost, like at the gas stations or per household, you can follow this link to know the details cost at the household or at the gas stations or the cost per liter of fuel. Federal carbon pricing will not exempt gasoline, will exempt gasoline and diesel fuel used by registered farmers in certain farming activities. I'm not sure what do they mean by certain farming activities. The guide wasn't very detailed when it came to agriculture. I believe it's the same system like before, when farmers buy fuel at bulk, probably they have to repay it, or probably similar to the previous system. But that's how exactly was mentioned in the guide. According to the government of Saskatchewan, the impact of $50 carbon tax on Saskatchewan economy would be equal to $2.5 billion annually. Most of this cost would be at the electricity sector, oil and gas, natural gas, agricultural fertilizer will also be affected, diesel farm will be affected, gasoline farm will be affected. This cost is expected to increase through the supply chain, increase the price of inputs that farmers are need to purchase. An overview of Canada's emission. In 2016, the total emission in Canada was equal to 704 million tons of CO2 equivalent, a reduction by 3.8% compared to the 2005 level of emission, which was 732 million tons. The energy sector occupies around 81% of total Canada's emission. As you can see in orange, dark blue, and light blue, energy combustion, energy transportation, and energy fugitive occupy more than 570 million tons of CO2 equivalent, or 80% of Canada's emission. Agriculture in 2016 emitted 60 million tons of CO2 equivalent, or what's equal to 8.5% of total Canada's emission. Very important to mention here that in the long run, Canada's economic growth was growing much faster than the growth in greenhouse gas emission. And that is measured by the emission intensity, which is the greenhouse gas per GDP. As you can see in the orange line, in 2016, the emission intensity was 35% lower compared to the level in 1990, and 20% lower compared to the 2005. In addition, Canada's per capita emission decreased from 22.7 ton in 2005 to 19.1 ton in 2016, or a reduction of 16%. So in total, the reduction in 2016, as I mentioned, it's only 3.8%. However, when we look at it in terms of economic side, the emission intensity is lower by 20% or 35% if you compare to the 1990, and emission per capita is lower by 16%. At the provincial level, Saskatchewan occupies 11% of total Canada's emission, or what's equal to 76 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2016. Saskatchewan emission increased by 10.7% in 2016 compared to 2005. Manitoba's emission increased by 3.5%, and Alberta's emission, which Alberta is the highest emission in Canada, increased by 14%. Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia emission decreased by 11%, 22%, and 5%. The distribution of greenhouse gas emission in Saskatchewan is mostly at the transportation, oil and gas, and electricity. agriculture occupies 24% of Saskatchewan emission. I'm not sure about this 24%. This data I obtained from the guide that Saskatchewan government released, Prairie Resilience. And I'm not sure if they include in this measurement land use change and forest. So they did not mention if they include that. And many of lots of Environment Canada measurements do not include land change and land use and land change. And this is important for Saskatchewan as we adopted conservation tillage and land management have changed. So 24%, I'm not sure about this number. Back to the measurements that we've done at the University of Saskatchewan. So basically in the next slides, I will be showing you the assessment of emission and sink of the main crop gases that are emitted by the crop sector. I will start with soil carbon sequestration or carbon sink. Then I will show you the carbon production emission, which include the nitrogen oxide emission from fertilizer application, from crop residue, and from summer fallow. And the emission from CO2 emission from fuel use on farm and for transportation. The net greenhouse emission is then calculated by subtracting the crop production emission from the soil carbon sequestration. The 2016 estimates will be compared to the 2005 and 1985, the base year, to track the historical changes in the reduction in the greenhouse gas emission in the Saskatchewan crop sector. This study is conducted at the Statistics Canada crop districts, which divides Saskatchewan into 9 agricultural crop districts and 5 soil zones: brown, dark brown, thin black, thick black, and gray. We included all the majority of the crops, including cereals, oilseeds, pulses, alfalfa, etc. We use a prairie crop energy model to allocate the cropland into 22 crop activities, taking into consideration the type of soil, land management, crop rotation, etc. Every crop activity is grown after conventional conservation or no-tillage practices and can be grown after summer fallow crop rotation or crop rotation. Just to mention here that this measurement is not an easy measurement, especially for economists, not environmental person. And as Dr. Brian mentioned in the morning, it's all about finding the right rates of carbon sequestration or emission. So for that, we use previous studies on the Canadian prairies, including Campbell et al., McConkie et al., different years, IPCC, Tier 1, and Environmental Canada, FAN et al., different studies on the Canadian prairies who measured the rate of sequestration and rate of emission on the Canadian prairies or in Canada in general. So start with the soil carbon sequestration, where soil can be source or sink of carbon, depends on the current and previous crop production system. This source sink behavior depends on the processes of photosynthesis and the incorporation of crop organic matter into the soil, and this is the process of carbon sink. The decomposition of that organic matter by soil organism generate emission or CO2 source of emission. The adoption of no-tillage management practice has enabled higher carbon return to soil through the use of crop rotation, residue retention, reduction of summer fallow, and reduced tillage practices. In addition, no-tillage improves soil water storage capacity and thus improves soil organic matter, soil biomass, and results in the increase in soil organic carbon stocks. This is the equation that we used, to measure soil carbon sequestration. I'm not going to go through details in it, but we took into consideration the characteristics of every crop sector, soil characteristics, type of type of crop, land management, etc., soil biomass, and we use previous studies rate of carbon sequestration that were done on the Canadian prairies or in Saskatchewan. Well, here is a result of the carbon sequestration from 1985 to 2016. As you can see, in 1985, carbon sequestration was very low, equal to, based on our measures, 0.2 million ton of CO2 equivalent. Carbon sequestration started to increase in the 1990s, as you can see, to reach in 2005 around 5.3 million ton to CO2 equivalent. Carbon sequestration continues to increase to reach around 9 million ton of CO2 equivalent in 2016. Total carbon sequestration for the full period is 125 million ton of CO2 equivalent. If we try to price that at only $10 per ton of CO2, that will be equal to $1.028 billion. At $15 per ton of CO2, that will be a value of $1.5 billion. Farmers were not compensated for this effort, just to mention here. Well, the carbon sequestration, just to mention here, started to increase in the 1990s, and this is in parallel with the adoption of no-tillage, and farmers adopted no-tillage that maximized their profitability. It was very profitable for them. So this kind of innovation not only improved farmers' profitability, but also reduced greenhouse gas emission. Just to give you an idea about the profitability of no-tillage on the Canadian prairies, between the year of 1985 and 2012, total benefit of no-tillage was equal to $24.45 billion. Most of this benefit was generated at the farm level in the short and long run. Saskatchewan occupied 62% of the total benefit of no-tillage because of the greater arable land in Saskatchewan and the high adoption rate. The benefit in this period was about $15 billion. Moving to crop production emissions, so that was the good news, now the bad news. Crop production emissions, so we calculated the crop production emission from fertilizer use, crop residue, and from nitrogen oxide from fertilizer use and crop residue is mostly because of the nitrification and denitrification of nitrogen in the soil. And we also calculate nitrogen oxide from summer fallow. Also, there is no nitrogen application in summer fallow, but the temperature of the soil and soil moisture and the nitrogen in the soil affects the emission from affect this emission. Then we measure the CO2 emission from fuel use. This is from the use of equipment on the farm, and from transportation. This is to move the harvested grain and inputs. And we converted everything to CO2 equivalent. Total emission in 2016 was equal to 9 million ton of CO2 equivalent, a 45% higher compared to the 2005, which was 6.2 million ton, a 70% higher compared to the 1985, which was 5.3 million ton. Let's go into details about the source of this emission. From residue, the emission increased from 1.5 million ton to 2.3 million ton in 2005 to 2.7 million ton. And this is normal as farmers are retaining more residue now to protect the land from erosion. So there is an increase from the emission from keeping the residue on top. Fertilizer emission increased from 0.7 to 1.2 to 2.2. Emission from summer fallow decreased from 0.8 to 0.5 to 0.1. These two emissions are correlated. The reduction in the emission from summer fallow actually causes the increase in the emission in fertilizer. As you can, they are correlated somehow. As you can see, the blue line, summer fallow area decreased by around 50% in 2005, and now the total area in summer fallow is around 3% in Saskatchewan only. Summer fallow land was transferred to production, so the land that was idle now is grown, it was replaced by canola and pulses mostly. And that increase in the production of the crop, as you can see in the green line, the production in 2016 increased by 50%. For sure, the increase in the cropland, the production of cropland will increase the use of fertilizer. So that's why the nitrogen fertilizer doubled between the year of 2005 to 2016. So that's why the reduction in summer fallow increased cropland in production and increased the use of fertilizer for sure. Fuel on farm reduced from 1.8 to 1.4 to 1.2 million ton. And the reason behind that the hours to operate farms on a tractor, let's say, or any other equipment reduced. For example, in 1985, farmers were probably spending 800 hours on tractor to seed and to control weeds. Now it's less than 200 hours for an average farm. Fuel transportation increased dramatically to move grains. Went from 0.2 in 1985 to 0.6 in 2005 to 2.6 million ton of CO2 equivalent. And the reason behind that, actually many reasons, is that the increase in the farm size, which increased the distance between the farmyard and the farmland. Reduction in the number of grain bins on farms, farmers tries to centralize operations. Grain delivery points in Saskatchewan have been reduced dramatically from 1,031 in 1985 to 162 in 2016. Consolidation of crop input suppliers, as many of these grain delivery points also sell inputs for farmers. So because of these factors, the distance increased and the cost, the emission from transportation to move harvested grain and inputs increased. Now putting all the numbers together to calculate the net greenhouse gas emission, the carbon sequestration in green, total crop emission in red, and the net emission or sink, which is the subtraction of carbon sequestration and total crop emission. The green line as a blue line indicates that in 1985, net emission in the crop sector in Saskatchewan was around 5 million ton of CO2 equivalent. The emissions started to decrease in the 1990s to reach around 0.8 in 2005. So went from 5 million to 0.8 million in 2005. In 2009 and 2013, greenhouse gas emission in Saskatchewan was negative, indicating net sink. So the sector was not emitting, was actually a sink of carbon. The emission in 2016 was equal to 0.1 million ton or almost zero. So the sector is mostly neutral emission, so it's not emitting. So that's the final results that we found, by measuring greenhouse gas emission in the crop sector. To conclude, the adoption of sustainable farming practices increased carbon sequestration and reduced net greenhouse gas emission. Carbon sequestration went from 0.2 million ton in 1985 to 5 million ton in 2005 and to 9 million ton of CO2 equivalent in 2016. As a result, that decreased the net emission in Saskatchewan from the Saskatchewan crop sector from 5 million ton of CO2 equivalent in 1985 to around 0.9 in 2005 to around 0 or 0.1 million ton of CO2 equivalent in 2016. This decrease exceeds by multifold Canada's commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 30% below the 2005 level of emission. The great efforts by the Saskatchewan farmers since the 1985 should be recognized and compensated. And not only from 2005, as much of this sequestration happened in the 1980s and 2000 and early 2000. So by 2005, net emission was 0.8. So already farmers had done lots of effort from the 1980s to 2005. So farmers should be compensated for the full period. The result of this study provide evidence that might support the design of policies that encourage the adoption of sustainable farming practices to mitigate greenhouse gas emission in agriculture sector. I personally support very much the research and development in nitrogen and fertilizer, especially that the nitrogen fertilizers that exist in the market is not efficient. 50% of the nitrogen goes waste. The soil does not absorb 50% of the nitrogen that we apply on the soil, and that goes into emission. So lots of studies now is on understanding the interaction between soil, microbiome, and roots. So to understand, how much exactly every plant needs in terms of nitrogen fertilizer. So these kinds of studies, if successful, we hope that will reduce the rate of nitrogen application and thus decrease the emission from the crop sector. When it comes to fuel for transportation, I'm not sure what innovations that can be done to reduce that. I mean, how can we reduce the distances and to move grains and inputs? So we'll see what farmers can do and what are the efforts that they're going to be doing, to reduce greenhouse gas emission. Well, thank you, and if you have any question.
John Bannier, liked your presentation. What I think would be a useful addition to it, and it shouldn't be too difficult, is if you got the net emissions per